Julie and I, we hit below the belt. We give it to you the way it comes to us and what we understand. And the background that Julie and I both have in the deliverance ministry to show us the occult, the Illuminati, the globalist, the information that is being withheld from us on the end time events because of these organizations. And so we're very thrilled to have Gill on to bring this information. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to go ahead and bring Gill on. Gill, go ahead and just introduce yourself, and then we'll get into to tonight.
All right, well, thank you, Scott. Like you had said earlier, I'm an amateur astronomer, and my previous livelihood was made in the oil field, in the offshore and inland facilities. You know, it's a design and engineering, and then this research I did right here carried me into a new field, which is astronomy. Anything, and that's how I came across this planet. I call it Planet 7X because it doesn't fit the total jargon that's put on the internet for sure. This started from a white paper report. The Chinese. This report is called the reevaluation of the Eastern and Western records of the supernova of 1054, and they clearly show that this is an object that moved through different constellations. The object that they saw, the supernova, actually occurred a few months earlier, and that what we had assumed was a supernova is not. It's a very large object that came through our solar system. And they observed it for, I think, 26 months. And from that, I was able to plot an orbit of it. And it shocked me. It was it ended up being on Earth's planetary plane, and it crossed Earth's plane twice. And it came in at around the end of August, circled the sun, and exited around the month of March, which is roughly about 150 to 152 days separation. And that 150 to 152 days sounded exactly what I read in the Bible in two different areas. The one about Noah's flood, where it rained for 40 days, and then after 150 days there was a great wind that passed. That after that wind he saw the water recede, which ancient languages failed to give us some of the details because we have many modern words which were not misexpressed in ancient languages. So with that great wind they're saying, I'm thinking that's a meteor impact that hit the Earth so severe that it knocked off actually 71% of our continental crust. And that coalesced into a moon between 300 to 400 years later. And actually the volume of the moon actually equates to the volume of our oceans. And so some of the math here lines up with quite incredible. And this document, it actually also helps prove out there's a little controversy between astronomy and physics. Like for a comet, astronomy says that the tail of a comet is ice particles, and the physicists are saying that the tail is plasma. So you can read the story about Joshua's long day, and it's whenever we run the same model during his time period, you see that Earth is going through the tail of the comet. And if it's plasma, that will cause a 12-hour delay. If it's water vapor, it won't. And exactly, there's additional text that says about an hour to 2 hours later was a meteor shower. Well, that's roughly what it would take. If an object passed between the moon and the Earth about midway, and it was roughly 7 times the diameter of Earth, between 6.5 and 7.5. That's the time period it would take for it to reach the meteor shower, and for the meteor shower to end, which would be about 1 hour later. And for instance, there's another verification. If you look at Yeshua's sacrifice, it mentions a 3-hour eclipse. You can't have a 3-hour eclipse not on Passover, because the full moon is on the opposite side of Earth, and a solar eclipse about a moon can only give you, I think it's between 7 to 10 minutes long. And for it to be a 3-hour eclipse, it's automatically describing a third object, a very large third object. And you can also read in the text where there was quakes, earthquakes at the time. So there's evidence if we look for it. I was a skeptic about the general topic about planet X. And I still am as far as that term going around. But I've accumulated data. I think there's 3 different scientific reports, white paper reports. There's where they sent the NASA and the Pioneer probes. Then there's these biblical incidents, about 10 of them. If we look at this, there's, I think, 88 constellations, and all of the data is pointing to one, which is Sagittarius, and not just anywhere in Sagittarius, but on the ecliptic. Well, for that level of data to be lining up is next to impossible. It really points to we have a serious problem coming into our solar system. Are you there, Scott?
Yes. You first referred to this as Planet X. Is this the same planet that everyone's talking about, but you're calling it 7X? Is that my understanding?
Yes. Yes, because the parameters are different. It's not 3,600 years. It's closer. If you had to put a number to it, which this is not a stable orbit, it'd be closer to 360. See, if an object is coming to the angle of the solar system, there's hardly any type of debris that would for it to collide with that would cause an issue with its speed. But since this is on the planetary plane and all the moons and planets are potential objects in its way, it has collided with certain planets and moons in our solar system. This one object can clearly explain many of the anomalies that are in our universe. And this is a direct quote from Dr. Harrington from the Naval Observatory. He was the head astronomer. And I totally agree with him because it can explain it. Now, he had estimated that it was closer to about 1,100 year orbit was what his estimate, because he didn't have enough data. And he had shown that it was he was thinking that it was clockwise in its rotation around the sun, but with the Chinese data, it clearly shows us that it's counterclockwise with a much shorter orbit. And
okay.
And this is why I have to name it differently, because the parameters and the qualifiers for this thing is different. We have hard facts.
If it were to qualify as something else, like a an asteroid or a meteor, it would not be in this type of orbit? Is that what you're saying?
It could be, but it couldn't add up to it wouldn't have been noticeable at 13 months out. Okay, it would take a much larger object because the Chinese astronomers in 1054 didn't have telescopes. They were only using their naked eye. And the maximum for average trained person looking at stars would be either 6 to 6.5 magnitude and brightness that they would be able to be noticed without any telescope. So using that factor and putting it in the model, and we have a very large object. And using, I think, 3 other Pacific notes and writings of ancient, like there was one that in Velikovsky's book, some of the Middle East scrolls had mentioned that during Joshua's time that they saw an object that was equivalent to 50 times the size of the moon. That's their view from Earth. Well, if you take an object roughly 50% of the distance between the moon, well, that object's roughly around 6.5 to 7.5 times the diameter of Earth. And that also gives us the exact qualifier for 3 hours of darkness during Yeshua's sacrifice. I think there's another qualifier, but it doesn't come to mind at the moment, where an object roughly 6.5 to 7.5 would have worked also. So that's what I'm backing this analogy. We have a real object that the Chinese saw.
If we can't see it with the naked eye, then can we see it with our telescopes or any of the other technology that we have, like on Mount Graham with the infrared scopes?
I would think so. I mean, well, put it this way. If we reverse the model, that meant there's a date given in the book of Revelation 12:1, that alludes to a date because it's given us an astronomical lineup in the sky. It says the moon at the foot of Virgo with a crown of 12 stars. Leo is normally drawn 11. The 12th star is Jupiter. And the word sun there is not sun because you can't see the stars unless there's an eclipse. Okay, that word there is illuminated body, which is most commonly used in Hebrew. That illuminated body is actually this comet-type object. And the model shows that the tail is illuminating Virgo only. As the text specifically says, only Virgo is illuminated, not all the constellations, which the sun will illuminate all of them. But in the model, the tail is only illuminating Virgo because it's on the planetary plane of Earth. And when we go with that date and we reverse the model, it showed that it entered our solar system roughly about 2000. So telescopes should have seen it in 2000. Now, if we reverse it even further than that, we go back to 1992, around December, when NASA went quiet pertaining to Planet X and their space probes that was hunting for it. It places this object exactly between 2 of the probes, exactly at the same angle of distance between it. That's exactly what you would expect from an engineer plotting the orbit of 2 satellites from Earth if they knew an object was there. And that was roughly in 1992, December. And so we should have seen it when it reached about 2000. But if you look at what's taken place since 92 or since 2000, since it's entered our solar system, this one object would explain the severe weather patterns, the volcanoes, the earthquakes, the fish kills, the overactive sun, and one of the main things, would explain is the magnetic field of Earth that's moving at 12 times its normal rate. It takes usually another magnetic field to influence a magnetic field. And there's just a recent study, I don't have it in front of me, but a university had just made a printed article that, remember that laser finder that they placed on the moon to measure the distance?
Mm-hmm.
The moon has just now been measured at its most furthest point. It went way beyond its ever expected point. Okay, in its elliptical orbit. And that was just documented. They don't know why it went so far beyond its norm. The only thing that can move a moon like that is a gravity body. Mm-hmm. And as I mentioned earlier, there's two other white paper reports. There's one from UL that mentioned that the study of comets, and I forgot how many they've studied, like over 100, I believe, and they found something like, I think 20-something comets where the orbits were disturbed by unknown gravity. This was also confirmed in an independent study in the EU by John Murray. And this is the same area of space in Sagittarius. Sagittarius is the same area where the Pioneer and Voyager probes went. Sagittarius is the same area where the Chinese, the Japanese astronomer, and the Korean astronomers saw this object coming from. There's only 88 constellations. How is it that all the data is pointing to one? We have a real object. It was seen by the Chinese, Korean, and Japanese astronomers. We have a plot of its orbit. Now we just have to figure out when it's going to arrive, but we have all the precursors of an inbound planet, if you clearly look at what's going around us. There's only one common denominator that explains all of this.
Now, I noticed you mentioned supernovas. What in relation is that for those of us that are not into astronomy?
It's well known in astronomy that there's many papers written that there was a supernova in 1054, and this was done probably before the turn of the century, or the previous turn of the century, and there had many articles written, but no one went back to check this one scientist that made the claim that he found it in the Chinese records. And when they went back in modern times, there is two papers written on this. He either fudged the numbers, if you wish to say, or his interpreter was bad, one of the two. But this object moved through multiple constellations. Supernova cannot move; it's stationary. It'll always be in the same constellation. Okay. So if you look back in the records just a few more months, that's when the supernova happened. But a supernova has never been documented to be visibly seen for 26 months. This has never been, if you look at it carefully. This is a very large comet-type object. And the visual perspective depends on how close it is. It's relative to the position of Earth. You know, if Earth is far away from it, it would look like, just like you look at Jupiter and Night Sky, but it would be a large comet, you know. But if you're in March at the time or September, when it's coming around, like, for instance, Joshua's long day, they saw an object 50 times larger than the moon. This also explains, remember in Hezekiah's time, it is documented worldwide that the calendars at one point was 360-day years. But during around 700 BC, all calendars globally changed to 365. And if you read the details of Hezekiah's story, you see that, now in the English, it's not interpreted correctly. It says that the shadow went back on a sundial, 10 degrees. That's not what the Hebrew says. The Hebrew says it went back 10 steps. Now, the reason why it can't be a sundial, that means that's the east to west motion. That means the Earth would have had to stop, reverse, stop again, and pick up speed 3 or 4 times to come back to its original time, because there's no mention of a delay in, it's an extended day. But if you use steps and face it south, you will see that the Earth tilted. The object came close enough to Earth. They attract like two magnets. They tilt to each other 26 to 28 degrees. And I found this tilt at least 3 times already in history. And that tilt caused the shadow to go backwards on the steps and then forward again. And that moved Earth's orbit slightly outward, giving us a longer year to go around the sun. That's why we went from 360 to 365 and a quarter. And that's documented globally, almost every culture. This is a logical explanation of that.
Because you mentioned the Chinese documents, you're talking about that goes way back, as well as something recent in relation to the white paper docs?
Yes, the most recent was 1054, so that's why it breaks the model of 3,600 years. This is only in 1054 A.D. Now, I found other mentions of this same object in a different period of time. Let me see here. Around Joseph of Egypt. It mentions this object came around in the 1400s. Well, what's interesting about Joseph here, let me pull up my data real quick. Okay. We have also a tilt of the Earth. Remember how he had a 7-year drought?
Yes.
And, we have 3.5-year drought coming in, 3.5-year drought as it's leaving. That's a common denominator throughout history. You can find this multiple times stated in the Bible, even though they don't know what caused it. Many of the times it's this object. There's a object called the Nibiru disk. It's the oldest documented symbolizing the star patterns in Europe. It's the oldest, maybe even in the world.
Is that the sky disk?
Yes, it's called the Nibiru sky disk, or the sky disk of Nibiru. Nibiru was a colony that was about 15 to 20 miles southeast of another ancient Miss Observatory in Gothic, Germany. It is my belief that this disk was actually made at the ancient Miss Observatory. And if we look at the star patterns, because I disagreed with the official findings of it, they were putting it outside the Bronze Age. Some of these professors were. And if we look at it closely, we can, and I explained each part of it. But what the disk is showing is that there was a total eclipse without the moon being involved, because the moon is shown to the right of it, and it shows planets and constellations, which we were able to identify. And with the arrangement of the planets the way it's shown here, gives us a date in astronomy software, 1810 BC, April. Now, if we compensate from the 360 to 365 day issue between Hezekiah, which was in 700 BC, we have to subtract 16 years for that. That gives us April 6, 1794. Well, that puts you smack dab where Joseph of Egypt's drought was. And this was the same object that they were documenting in Germany at the time when Joseph was in Egypt. And this shows that they had about roughly a 3-hour eclipse. And remember how Joseph had a dream at age 16 that he said he saw the sky bow to him? He said he had 11 stars, which is Leo, and the sun and the moon bowed to him. Well, this was when he was 40 years, and when he was 40 years old in Egypt, it actually happened. And I can prove to you that because of the way this thing passed, that the Earth actually tilted 26 to 28 degrees, and the skies bowed to him literally because of the Nibiru disk. Because you cannot see the constellation on that Nibiru disk called Monsieur Orion from that latitude at that time of year, framed with Gemini to the left and Capricorn to the right. You have to have a latitude of Luxor, Egypt. And guess what? That's 26 to 28 degree tilt. And the constellation Monsieur Orion is shown during April on that disk, and it cannot be seen normally from the latitude of Germany. It's proving a tilt happened.
With this kind of information that's showing the issues on the planet prior, why is NASA or any of the other governments not bringing this to the public eye? What do you think's going on?
Well, if you do a little research, number one priority for government is to protect markets. Without markets, they don't have government revenue to be able to do any good for the people if they wish to. So, number one, they have to protect the markets. So would they really announce such a thing coming in? Not yet, anyway. Matter of fact, it lines up with, you remember Jonah, the story of Jonah? Jonah happened in the same time as Hezekiah, about 40 days earlier. He was in Nineveh, and Hezekiah was in Jerusalem. He gave a 40-day warning to Nineveh. Now, Nineveh, why is it, what's interesting about the story of Jonah is what's not being said. There was no miracles that Jonah performed. Why is it he just went in there and said, look, your doom comes in 40 days? And then they all repent, even the king? Try that today and tell me what sort of results you get. The reason why he got results was because when you look at the model, at 40 days, this is coming around the sun. It's clearly seen from Earth at 40 days. Because they already saw the pre-signs. They saw fish kills, probably, volcanoes and earthquakes, and changing in the seasons. And they want to know what was wrong, what was going on, because they were very in tune with the seasons at the time and their surroundings. They knew something was wrong. So the only thing Jonah had to do is just point to the sky. See this object? Your doom comes in 40 days. So basically what that story is telling us is the government is really going to be telling us, give us a warning only about 40 days. That's what the general public will have. Before that, they'll tell you it's a comet. And this, when you see a comet that's on the ecliptic coming out of Sagittarius, and the last time we'll see it at night would probably be in December, around Hanukkah. After that, it starts switching to the daytime skies. And you see it mostly in the daytime skies after that point.
I remember you mentioned something in another program about solar sails that may have been launched by NASA in an attempt to possibly block any visual view of that. Could you kind of explain that a little more for the people?
Well, there was less people with telescopes, and the telescopes maybe weren't quite as good. They may have used a solar sail because I saw that they had one built in the mid-'90s. but there's no record of them launching it. Now, if you're going to go through the process of building it, and it's about half the size of a football field, what was it used for then? And so they may have used that at the beginning, but as far as right now, a solar cell would not be able to be enough to cover it. They'd either have to project a hologram or some other technology that I'm not aware of, but we have all the effects of it, but we can't see it right now. And I know I'm going to get hundreds of emails. I see it. No, that is not it. It's not a sundog. It's not a glitch of brightness on a lens of a camera. Everything that I've seen right now is not a valid sighting of this planet. When we see it, it's going to look more like a comet because it's entirely too close right now. If this date in Revelation 12:1 is correct, and I have no reason to say that it's not at the moment, because so far all the signs are still escalating. To give you, for instance, someone tallied up, I think it was the volcanoes. No, I think it was the earthquakes for our previous century, and gave an average on what it would be for a year. Well, that average is exceeded in one day now. One yearly average, we're having that many earthquakes in one day. Is there a logical explanation for this? Only one that I can see is an approaching body. There's only one thing that can perturb our moon, our outer planets, comets, dozens of them, upset our sun. All the planets are showing signs of heating up, and as well as the Earth is heating up. That's why you have the crust expanding, and that's why you have volcanoes and earthquakes that are prevalent. We're going through a drought in many areas of the globe. We had significant drought starting at the end of 2012. And guess what? 3.5 years later, that ends up with the date of March 2016 as the Bible is giving. I didn't give the date. I'm just interpreting what they're showing as a date, because they didn't have a Gregorian calendar. The only way they could give us a date was using stars. And to tell you the truth, it's impossible for man to give us that date at that time period. This was given to us over 2,000 years ago. Constellation shifts over about 1,800 years. In other words, during Passover, it would have been Libra, the scales of judgment. Now, in Passover, is Virgo. To get Jupiter there, Jupiter has an orbit of 11-point-something years, cycle. Then the moon is 29.5 days, I believe. But then the tilt of the moon is 11 years, I believe. If you put all these factors together, then you needed to get at least 4 decimal places of accuracy to predict that date in Revelation 12:1. Now, how can we say they did this 2,000 years ago when a zero and a decimal place didn't exist yet?
I was curious about some of the dates that I had gotten from some of your past shows, Exodus, Jacob's troubles, and so forth. Why would the rotation or its appearance change? Is it because it's affected by other planets or runs into other things like you were saying? Why would there be a different date instead of something that comes, the same?
My research is still going on. I publish as I have new information. I'm about to possibly make a video on to better explain that. And I have a key factor there. It was the Exodus. What happened was we have a destroyed planet. If you use Fibonacci sequence of numbers using 3, that basically equals out the spacing of the planets. It tells us we should have a planet
where the asteroid belt is. Right now we have a remnant of a planet called Ceres with a bunch of debris. That used to be now scientists would say that's either, there's only two conclusions to that. It's either a malformed planet that never coalesced into, or it's a destroyed planet. I lean to it's a destroyed planet, and it was destroyed by head-on collision by an object bigger than it, which was planet 7X. When it came in and hit Ceres, it slowed planet X forward motion by 1/20th of its normal speed. That gave us 3 days of darkness listed in Exodus and many of the other points in Exodus. Remember the 3-hour eclipse during Yeshua? That's doing its normal speed. The Exodus was 3 days of darkness. It was formed, but its forward speed was slowed down by 1/20th. Then, if you look at the next event, which was Joshua's long day, it was only 52 years later before it came around, because it didn't have the momentum or the speed to carry it into deep space. So once it lost its forward speed, it just turned back around again. The gravity of the sun is pulling it back. So it pulled it back. 52 years later, it came back around. That was Joshua's long day. Then it went on to what Job's trouble. If you read about Job's trouble, it's fiery hail that destroyed his flock and his shepherd. And a great wind from that destroyed a house that his kids were in and killing all of his children. That happened 131 years later. At the same time of Job's trouble was Ruth and Naomi. They had mentioned a serious drought. They had 10 years of drought. Remember, this object is moving slow. Instead of 7, they had 10. Then 290 years later was the difference that King David and Saul had. Saul had 3.5-year drought at the end of his reign. David had 3.5-year drought at the beginning of his reign. That's 7. And the next year after that, it became its normal orbit. Roughly 358 years after that point was the next one that brought us to Hezekiah. So you have a progression. As it's picking up speed, it took almost 4 trips around the sun before it regained its entire normal orbit, if you want to call it normal. And if you look at, you can tell that we know something plowed into Pluto. It's at a very steep orbit, yet it used to be a moon of Neptune. Then we have 2 debris fields trailing and one ahead of Jupiter. Something was destroyed there. Whether it's moons of Jupiter or something else, but something was definitely destroyed there. They're in groups. Then we have Mars. If you look at the Mars craters, I think 92% of all of Mars craters are on the southern hemisphere. Why is that? Because that lower half at one time was on the, crossed the debris field of planet 7X. That only the lower half of its spherical shape crossed into the debris field. It was much closer to Earth's planetary plane. It got bumped. If you look at the elevation of Mars, a map of its elevation, you see a nice round curvature of a dark blue spot. That's where this planet bumped into it, causing cracks to appear on the opposite side, which is that big cavern. Looks like a scar on it. That was pressure put on it from this side, pushing over to the other side. And now it's at a much higher orbit. Now it doesn't cross planet 7. The backside of the moon has 4 times more craters than the near side. The moon has protected parts of Earth during these meteor showers. That's why there's 4 times more craters on the backside. And scientists have acclaimed. It appears that the meteor showers hitting Mars, that most of it happened within an hour or so, because of the direction and the way that they're overlapped. If we put this common denominator answers many of our mysteries in our universe and biblical mysteries.
It does look that way, and since it looks this way and has a great deal of a potential to be absolutely accurate, has there been any attempt to quiet you up?
No. I think mainly because if I mix science with the biblical, that leaves room for discrediting me in their eyes. And so, but I'm letting the evidence speak for itself. This is not about the messenger. Let the evidence and let people decide on their own. And you've seen some information that I cannot put out publicly because it's copyrighted. And what do you think of it?
Well, that's why we've got you on. Just like you said, when you put the evidence in front of the people, let them make the decision. And that's exactly what Julie and I do. In fact, I want Julie to come on here now, and I know she's got some questions. But, this is so important. It's so important for those who are Christians to understand that we're running out of time. We already know that. But what Gil is discussing is some of the factors that will bring this in, and we're going to be discussing the dates that you're going to predict that these things are coming. That it is so important that even other governments, if they're not discussing it, because NASA doesn't always have, some presidents over some other countries, but eventually you would think somebody's going to raise their hand up, and you talked about the markets. But when that does take place, we're going to talk about Jade Helm a little later and some of the other things. I can't help but think there is something tied with this that's getting ready for that. So Julie, what do you got for us here?
Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Yes.
Okay. Certain times of the year, he would notice as a deputy sheriff that people were acting very, very weird. And this is 20 plus years of doing this. And even now, he says he sees a very big change in human behavior, just totally different. It is, erratic, and a lot of the law enforcement departments that we know are getting extremely strange phone calls. And so I'm kind of wondering about the atmospheric changes, if that has any relation to it, because I know that has to have some effect on people's minds.
Yes, I can help you with that. See, I had an uncle. He was in the police force, and I had a wife and a mother-in-law and a sister-in-law that were also nurses. And both of them would say how things get very crazy during a full moon, that they can expect to be super busy during those times. And I even related that to the stock market. I was able to see the trends in the stock market because it's associated with the emotion factor. If you want to call it gravity, I don't believe the gravity of the moon is affecting us to that level. I'm saying that there's an unknown force, which is, if you want to call it the waves coming from the sun, like you ever seen a tornado or like a hurricane with the spiral clouds and winds coming out?
Yes.
Well, this is what's coming out from the sun as in plasma. And if you use a Fibonacci spiral and run it right through Earth and let it go through and connect to the moon, the moon and the tides do not line up exactly. They don't. They're off. But it does line up with the Fibonacci spiral. So it's not, I would not say that it's the gravity, but it is the solar winds that comes in, that's timed, that this is affecting us in our magnetic field. It strengthens it or weakens it. And as this object is coming closer, it's having a greater effect on us. So these magnetic fields are affecting people. And as this thing gets closer, you're going to have more extremes. I've talked to submariners that's gone under the North and South Pole, well, the North Pole. They've gone under it, and they're greatly affected by the magnetic fields there. They have to, their dream state when they're dreaming at night, sleeping, come very vivid and real. They'll wake up almost in a panic sometimes because it was so real. Their dream state during those high magnetic fields, and this is only going to get more intense as this object gets closer.
Right. Well,
and also animals. You're going to see that affecting animals as well.
I've actually seen that. And then in 2012, when all the birds started dropping out of the sky and animals were washing up on the beaches and they were beaching themselves, just continuing to do it over and over.
Yeah.
And now, what I'm Scott and I have talked about things like this before about peace being taken from the earth, and I'm wondering if that somehow ties into this whole, as this thing gets closer, because people are not. There are people who are not. They don't have the hope of Jesus Christ. They don't have the Holy Spirit indwelt in them to be able to, keep a straight mind. There are people out there that just don't know, and I'm wondering if that's going to have this peace being taken from the earth has something to do with this thing getting closer and closer and closer. So.
Sure. Well, and also in Revelation it says, "My people perish for lack of knowledge," not lack of religion or faith. It said they perish for lack of knowledge. Underline, emphasize, quotation marks, knowledge. If we don't get a grip with the proper science, because there are some errors in astronomy, because they think the tail of a comet is water vapors. If this date is correct, and the information in Revelation is also correct, and what they look at as data, it says some extreme things. Let me just quote a few. It says that every wall on earth will be cracked. Every wall. It says the earth will be split. It says a sea shall die. The life in the sea shall die. A third of the life. It says 1/3 of the trees, 1/3 of the grass, and 1/3 of the rivers will be burned up from a meteor shower, basically. It says earth is hit so hard in on the second event, because there's 2 meteor showers. That CO6 is the first meteor shower. CO7 is the second meteor shower. That it's the size of a fiery mountain that hits the earth. Earth is hit so hard that it wobbles like a drunkard. Now explain to me how they could visualize this if they didn't even know the earth was a globe. They didn't even know that America existed, which is 1/3 of the continental crust. Remember, when Earth is going through a meteor shower, half of it is protected and half of it is being hit. The dark half, in March, it's the daylight side that's going to be hit. The nighttime side is protected because the meteors are coming in from the sun, from that side of the sun. And it clearly says 1/3 of trees, grass, and rivers. They didn't have a word for continental crust, but they're describing continental crust. That is North and South America, it's telling us. That's half of the globe. The second event will again hit us, but it'll be on a nighttime, which is 152 days later. And that's on the nighttime side of Earth. Again, hitting mostly America, but also the Fire Mountain hits the ocean. That's the Pacific Ocean. And that's where the seas boil, it says, because of the lava, also the rolling up of the waves, because boiling can also mean multiple tidal waves. But the Bible describes this next event as the worst time in Earth's history. We're taking Noah's flood and many other. That's not the worst. Noah's flood is not. This is going to be. Well, then you better fill your little hat with knowledge on what will be occur, what are the precursors, and what to expect, and how to prepare for it. Because you need to be at the pivot point of the tilt. When Earth tilts again 26 to 28 degrees, that means the surface of the Earth from point A to point B, you have that movement of 1,800 miles within 6 hours or so. Well, that's roughly 300-mile-an-hour winds. If you're in an open plain, flat ground, you're looking at 300-mile-an-hour winds. Now, of course, most areas are not flat, but you're probably getting 150-mile-an-hour winds. And that's 90 degrees from the pivot point. That would, if the Bible is indicating that Jerusalem will be this pivot point of tilt, or the Middle East will. Therefore, if you go 90 degrees from that point, you're looking about midway of South America or midway of Australia. And that's the eastern coastline of America, would be where the highest winds would be. Arctic Circle would come down to Washington, D.C. with high winds. You're looking at things being flash frozen. Remember those herds of mammoths they found in northern Siberia? They had vegetation in their mouth they didn't have time to swallow when they froze to death. They were flash frozen. They were caught in a tilt. It brought them further north temporarily with high winds. They froze to death instantly. Entire herds.
I remember seeing that and just wondering how that happened. I mean, you know, it was amazing when I watched them uncover this stuff. And Trey Smith does, I don't know if you know Trey Smith, but he does a really good job at God in a Nutshell project. And he has some DVDs, a couple of them on Noah. And he tried to explain the same thing. But all this is what you're saying is going to be repeated. But, I mean, a lot of that's going to be repeated now again, but then even worse. It's going to be even more catastrophe.
Each story in the Bible is not random. They're giving us data points for the final conclusion of the final book. You don't realize this until you run the data. Let me give you some. Okay, we have Noah's flood. That gives us the 150-day spacing, but that was during a year that was 360. Then we have 364 years later, we have Solomon and Gomorrah, where, remember, Lot's wife, okay, the man's description was she was turned to a pillar of salt. When in actuality, there were two towns that were destroyed. When they got behind protective wall or whatever, one of the towns was destroyed from meteors, let's say, okay, brimstone and fire. Then when she heard the first explosion, she came back from her protective area to look at the town. That's when the second town got destroyed. Remember that meteor that went over Russia just within the last, I think, about a year or so ago? Mm-hmm. And it exploded in between about 7 towns. And it exploded high enough where they only had the concussion. They didn't suffer vaporization. It was like 20 to 30 times larger than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. But it wasn't close enough to the town to vaporize the people. But if it would have exploded closer to the surface, they would have been vaporized. Lot's wife was vaporized, and a shadow was left on the rock face, just like in Nagasaki. So when ancient man came around and tried to describe what they saw, they say, look, God turned it to a pillar of salt. This was during the same time frame as the Tower of Babel. And the ancient Talmud gives us a little inkling of historical records pertaining to this that says the top was burned. Well, how can you burn a brick structure? A stone structure. They said the top was burned. The base was sunken into the sand. That's liquefaction from the earthquakes. The object that they saw, the supernova, actually occurred a few months earlier, and that what we had assumed was a supernova is not. It's a very large object that came through our solar system, and they observed it for, I think, 26 months. And from that, I was able to plot an orbit of it, and it shocked me. It was on it ended up being on Earth's planetary plane, and it crossed Earth's plane twice. And it came in at around the end of August, circled the sun, and exited around the month of March, which is roughly about 150 to 152 days separation. And that 150 to 152 days sounded exactly what I read in the Bible in two different areas. The one about Noah's flood, where it rained for 40 days, and then after 150 days there was a great wind that passed. That after that wind he saw the water recede, which ancient languages fail to give us some of the details because we have many modern words which were not misexpressed in ancient languages. So with that great wind they're saying, I'm thinking that's a meteor impact that hit the Earth so severe that it knocked off actually 71% of our continental crust. And that coalesced into a moon between 300 to 400 years later, and actually the volume of the moon actually equates to the volume of our oceans, and so some of the math here line.
And I, we hit below the belt. We give it to you the way it comes to us and what we understand. And the background that Julie and I both have in the deliverance ministry to show us the occult, the Illuminati, the globalist, the information that is being withheld from us on the end time events because of these organizations. And so we're very thrilled to have Gill on to bring this information. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to go ahead and bring Gill on. Gill, go ahead and just introduce yourself, and then we'll get into tonight.
All right, well, thank you, Scott. Like you had said earlier, I'm an amateur astronomer, and my previous livelihood was made in the oil field, in the offshore and inland facilities. You know, it's a design and engineering, and then this research I did right here carried me into a new field, which is astronomy. And that's how I came across this planet. I call it Planet 7X, because it doesn't fit the total jargon that's put on the internet for sure. This started from a white paper report. The Chinese. This report is called the reevaluation of the eastern and western records of a supernova of 1054, and they clearly show that this is a object that moved through different constellations. That lines up with it's incredible. And this document, it actually also helps prove out there's a little controversy between astronomy and physics. Like for a comet, astronomy says that the tail of a comet is ice particles, and the physicists are saying that the tail is plasma. So you can read the story about Joshua's long day, and whenever we run the same model during his time period, you see that Earth is going through the tail of the comet, and if it's plasma, that will cause a 12-hour delay. If it's water vapor, it won't. And exactly there's additional text that says about an hour to 2 hours later was a meteor shower. Well, that's roughly what it would take if an object passed between the moon and the Earth about midway, and it was roughly 7 times the diameter of Earth, between 6.5 and 7.5. That's the time period it would take for it to reach the meteor shower, and for the meteor shower to end, which would be about 1 hour later. And for instance, there's another verification. If you look at Yeshua's sacrifice, it mentions a 3-hour eclipse. You can't have a 3-hour eclipse not on Passover, because the full moon is on the opposite side of Earth, and a solar eclipse about a moon can only give you, I think it's between 7 to 10 minutes long. And for it to be a 3-hour eclipse, it's automatically describing a third object, a very large third object. And you can also read in the text where there was quakes, earthquakes at the time. So there's evidence if we look for it. I was a skeptic about the general topic about Planet X, and I still am as far as that term going around. But I've accumulated data. I think there's 3 different scientific reports, white paper reports. There's where they sent the NASA and the Pioneer probes. Then there's these biblical incidents, about 10 of them. If we look at this, there's I think 88 constellations, and all of the data is pointing to one, which is Sagittarius, and not just anywhere in Sagittarius, but on the ecliptic. Well, for that level of data to be lining up is next to impossible. It really points to we have a serious problem coming into our solar system. Are you there, Scott?
Yes. You first referred to this as Planet X. Is this the same planet that everyone's talking about, but you're calling it 7X? Is that my understanding?
Yes. Yes, because the parameters are different. It's not 3,600 years. It's closer. If you had to put a number to it, which this is not a stable orbit, it'd be closer to 360. See, if an object is coming to the angle of the solar system, there's hardly any type of debris that would for it to collide with that would cause an issue with its speed. But since this is on the planetary plane and all the moons and planets are potential objects in its way, it has collided with certain planets and moons in our solar system. This one object can clearly explain many of the anomalies that are in our universe. And this is a direct quote from Dr. Harrington from the Naval Observatory. He was the head Mr. Astronomer. And I totally agree with him because it can explain it. Now, he had estimated that it was closer to about 1,100 year orbit was what his estimate, because he didn't have enough data. And he had shown that it was he was thinking that it was clockwise in its rotation around the sun, but with the Chinese data, it clearly shows us that it's counterclockwise with a much shorter orbit. And this is why I have to name it differently, because the parameters and the qualifiers for this thing is different. We have hard facts.
If it were to qualify as something else, like an asteroid or a meteor, it would not be in this type of orbit. Is that what you're saying?
It could be, but it couldn't add up to it wouldn't have been noticeable at 13 months out. Okay, it would take a much larger object because the Chinese astronomers in 1054 didn't have telescopes. They were only using their naked eye. And the maximum for average trained person looking at stars would be either 6 to 6.5 magnitude and brightness that they would be able to be noticed without any telescope. So using that factor and putting it in the model, and we have a very large object. And using, I think, 3 other Pacific